You know, as I'm browsing the internet for some parts right now, it just made me realize that it's a great time to be alive in the world of FPV. I mean, there's just so many options now that if you just spend a little bit of time on the internet, chances are you'll find a tried and proven formula for just about any build that you could think of. I mean, pretty much, it's harder to go wrong than it is to go right these days. However, it wasn't always like this. And when I first got into FPV, 9 and 10-inch builds were the norm. And even then, the options was still pretty limited. And so when the idea of the mini quad came about, trying to fit everything into a smaller, more compact 5-inch form factor, I mean, it was basically new territory. And we were doing things like using motors and ESCs originally made for RC planes. We took big metal VTX boxes originally made for wings, and you needed to use an LC filter. Shoot, I remember flight controllers requiring a separate 5-volt source, and we were using the Hobby King Blue Series ESCs because it had a BEC in it. Like ESCs back then had a 5-volt regulator because it needed to power something like a servo, again, because it was made for something else. I remember going from 3S to 4S, you needed to flash your ESCs with some special Simon K firmware, specifically from March of 2015. Otherwise, you were gonna get desyncs, or you just fall out the sky, or just catch on fire. Shoot, flashing? Oh, guys, you have no idea how easy you have it right now. Anybody know what this is? This is an Atmel socket flasher. Just so you guys can appreciate how easy you've got it right now, let me just show you what we had to do back then in order to flash an ESC. You had to take your ESC, let's pretend this is an ESC. It has this Atmel chip on there. And what you had to do was you had to take this and you had to very carefully line things up right on top of that little chip right there. And then you basically look at it really closely as you kind of hold your breath, and then you take your elbow and then you'd hit that flash button, and then you'd sit there. Sometimes you'd shake a little bit, but you did everything that you can in your body to not let go or not let any of these other pins touch the other pin, because if you did, then you basically bricked your ESC. And as it's going, you look over to the monitor and you're like, oh my gosh, why is it stuck at 99? It feels like it's been at 99 forever. And even if you manage to not let the magic smoke out during your build, chances are it would as soon as you crash into something, just because back then ESCs could not handle the voltage spike during a crash. And then you'd go home, maybe you make a post about it to the forums that you belong on, and then you start looking for that next combination of parts that you wanted to try. And that's pretty much how it goes when you venture off into new territory. It's very much a guess and test kind of game. And the reason why I bring this up is because that's kind of where I'm at right now. The new territory that I'm venturing into, I call it 5-inch freestyle with 250 gram constraint. And this was my guess. This is my guesstimated motor spec. This is the AIO flight controller that I'm hoping is gonna work, and one of many iterations of the frame that I'm hoping won't have frame resonance. And now that I've got my guesses in place, it was time to test. But before we get to that, let's back up and explain how we got here. In my last video, I had explained my somewhat unorthodox design approach of starting with the motor first. It was important to me that the build had freestyle level response, and that's completely dependent on the motor's ability to control a prop, as well as the overall power that the build makes. Eventually, I concluded that this motor was going to do what I wanted, and so now the next step was designing the frame. And that starts with a spreadsheet. Basically, I calculated the weights of the parts that I knew that I was going to use to figure out what my frame budget was going to be.
Hold on. Hello?
Yo, what's up, man? Is now a good time?
Yeah.
Alright, so here's what I figured out. So, CAT-X Vista, we already know we're going to go with that. We are going to go with the DJI camera because the other CAT-X cameras aren't that great.
Okay.
Now, so the more important part is what I found during a full throttle punch out. It was basically spiking to about 32 amps before it would settle down, which tells me that even a weaker 350 milliamp pack with a 60C rating should be able to handle it. But I do want to play it safe because I do want to be able to push this thing without any concern. So I'm going to budget for a slightly bigger pack, and it looks like those are averaging at about 83 grams.
Yeah. Okay.
Now with the motors and the props and the amount of wire that we need to do the build, that is coming in at about 72 grams.
Okay.
And the flight controller is 8 grams. We can budget like another gram for a crossfire, receiver, and antenna. Basically, once all is said and done, we're looking at 53 grams left over before we hit that 250 gram limit. But here's the thing, like, we need to have like a buffer. Like, I don't want to use all 53 grams, so why don't we target like 45? That way, if there's any variances in the different parts that other people want to use, it's not, you know, hopefully it's close enough but not getting pushed over 250 grams. Alright, so as far as the frame itself, let's go for a symmetrical layout. Let's go for like a low profile deck. Let's try and stagger the components if we can, but we can't have the flight controller share any of the hardware or pass through the arms because we don't do that over here. And speaking of arms, it's a freestyle frame, so definitely gonna want some easily removable arms. And oh, we need to account for frame resonance. Let's try butting up the arms in the middle to give it more of that unibody stiffness, and let's bump the thickness up to 4 millimeters, and let's maybe even try and make it a little bit wider. I think all of those things put together will make for a nice, stiff, and durable enough of a frame. Are you getting into this, by the way? You seem kind of quiet. I feel like you're a little distracted.
No, man, I'm just working on it in my head.
So our first idea was actually really exciting. We took the remix and we started to redesign it in a way that would satisfy the new requirements. And it started off great. It was looking pretty awesome. But as we solved each design problem after the next, eventually, I don't know, man. You don't think this looks good, do you? Do you think we should go more of like a moon goat style? Yeah, let's go more of a moon goat style. Was that tuna you had for lunch? So back to the drawing board it was. And for days on end, we tried different things. We draw in new lines, only to later remove them. We tried different positions for the components, making sure that nothing would interfere with each other. Basically, trying to find that balance of keeping it light and what we think will be durable enough for the common crashes. Eventually, we arrived at something worth doing a vibration analysis on, just to make sure there would be no frame resonance. And once it passed that test, we printed it out to see what it looked like in real life. But there was still one thing that we couldn't agree upon, and that was how the camera would mount to the frame. You see, I had challenged ourselves to try something different, something that we've never done before. Maybe we do something like with a canopy of some sort. But I didn't want to wait anymore, so I decided to just go ahead and move forward and cut this frame out so that I can continue on my testing while Ryan worked on a solution for that camera. Let's go fly this thing. So the very first thing I did was hover around and a lot of cruising. I was paying attention to the things around me, looking for any kind of wobbles, oscillations, really looking for any indication of frame resonance. See, that was my biggest concern, because if there was any, well, what was the point in continuing? See, in my opinion, a good frame built with quality parts should fly well on stock PIDs, and stock filtering even. And how did this do? Well, so far, so good. Maybe perhaps the frame resonance would rear its ugly head higher up in the throttle range. But thankfully it didn't. It was just dead smooth. And even as I took it higher up above the treetops where it was windier, it pretty much flew unfazed. With my biggest concern behind me, it was time to find out which KVs I liked best. I started off by doing a couple of punch outs. And I gotta say, the first time I did it, it sort of caught me off guard, and I didn't even hit 100% full throttle. See, the power band comes on real early, which made this feel super responsive. And the hang time was a bit unexpected for me. Now, maybe I just had low expectations at the start, but I found this to be way more than what I was expecting for freestyle flying. I liked it. The next thing I tested was turning agility. I was trying to see how hard I could take a corner. How much throttle and stick input did I need to change direction? And what I found is that even with the bi-blade props, it didn't take much at all, which means that you don't have to fly this aggressively in order for it to do what you want. Now, in my opinion, the best test for agility is to see how quickly you can pull out of a dive. For me, this is a big thing because, well, it's something that I particularly enjoy doing when I freestyle, and it was the main thing I was personally looking for on this build. Now, it might be hard to tell from this video, but this is easily the hardest stopping 5-inch quad I have ever flown. Now, I'm completely guesstimating here, but it seems like it stops within just a couple of inches, which means you really could wait until the very last minute to pull out of a dive if you really wanted. So it didn't take long before I became confident with its abilities. Halfway through the first pack, I was already doing my usual freestyle flying, getting a feel for how it tosses around. So does it feel like the heavier GoPro quads? Well, no. I mean, you can't get around physics, but you can do the same things. I found that you just needed to stay on the power a little bit longer to make it over the same trees at similar angles. And it didn't take much for me to adjust for it at all. Perhaps the biggest thing I noticed was that it was much easier to hit this angled gap with these trees. You see, with the heavier GoPro quads, I had to be lined up way earlier on because there's just no room for correction once you're making your way down. But with this, I felt like you could correct your line all the way up until you hit the gap. It has such a huge bailout window. So I repeated these tests for all of the different KVs that I had. 1600, 1700, 1800 for 6S, and 2300 and 2400 KV for 4S. Alright, I finally finished testing all of the different KVs, and the results actually... Really? Alright. So, first of all, this thing is fun to fly. It's a little bit floaty, but it really makes for excellent hang time, and the agility, oh my goodness. You point and shoot. Basically, anywhere you want to go, you want to change directions, it just does it. It's definitely different to fly from a heavier rig, but it is fun. Now here's the thing. I originally came into this thinking, I'm probably gonna want the highest KV possible, make that crazy top end speed, and compensate for the fact that I've got a lower all-up weight. Now, what I found was that the higher the KV you got, you had higher top speed, but because of this crazy power to weight ratio, it was at the cost of decreased throttle resolution. Basically, the higher in KV you went, the more it felt like an on and off switch with the throttle. And so I actually found it more enjoyable to fly with the lowest KV. So for the 6S builds, I'm definitely gonna go for 1600 KV, especially because at the end of the day, all I was really looking for here was the ability to pull out of a dive coming from the moon at the very last second. And even at 1600 KV, that was absolutely no problem, which means making it tossable and super agile was absolutely no problem. And if I could even have it my way, I'd probably even go lower than 1600 KV. It's just that with the 24 stator, you actually can't wind it lower than 1600, so 1600 KV it is. And during my 4S test, I did feel that 2400 KV felt the best. It absolutely had no problems coming out of dives either. It was also very responsive and agile. But I also tested the 2400 KV on a 4-inch prop on 6S, and that thing was a screamer. It actually had even higher top speed than the 5-inch prop, but it did come in at a cost of having lower flight times. It just wasn't as efficient. And speaking of flight times, with the 6S 450 milliamp pack, I was getting anywhere between 5 to 7 minutes, just depending on how I was flying. And with the 4S 450 milliamp pack, I was getting closer to like 4 to 5 minutes. Now, here's the bad news. The frame did not come in at 45 grams. In fact, it came in at 52 with this temporary cam mount solution that we were using. But even at 52 grams, I don't know what I forgot to account for. Maybe I used a way heavier strap, I don't know, but this was definitely over 250 grams. Oh shit. So there's gonna be some work to be done here to find out if there's any opportunity that I can take to bring that weight down and see if I could hit that 250 gram mark. So at this point, it was just time to let my manufacturer know about my new KV decisions, in addition to a couple more changes that I want to make for production just to make the motors that much better. For starters, we didn't need the prop shaft to be this long, so we shrunk them down to be these tiny little nubs, thereby saving some more weight. And as far as the prop bolts go, I wanted to swap out the steel ones for these lighter weight titanium ones because apparently they weigh nothing. And finally, instead of using the typical divided motor wires, I wanted to use these flat ribbon style ones just to make the builds that much cleaner. Hey, alright, so before you get any further than this, I say we ditch the whole canopy thing and let's just go straight up for like a carbon style plate. And the reason is because I'm kind of thinking I want to put a naked GoPro on this thing now. I know, it wasn't originally in the plans. People can still build it without the GoPro as originally intended, but now I just kind of want to try that. So let's go with that kind of a design. Let's Cohen out, because the next thing we got to do now is crash test this thing. Thank you so much. You made it to the end of the video. I appreciate you. And based on the previous comments, it seems like you guys really enjoy these types of videos. So I'm doing my best to do them as fast as I can. It does take me a little bit of time, so I'd really appreciate you hitting that like button, do all of the things. And also the motors are available on my store, ohmygod.com, if you do want to attempt your own type of ultralight build. And last but not least, there is a sale, 25% off of liftoff licenses. So if you're new to FPV, I highly recommend that you practice and get your stick time in on a simulator. And liftoff is one of the more awesome ones because they've recreated things like the Duga antenna dive, which is by far my most memorable experience ever in my FPV career history. So check that out, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace out.